Too Much Information is a production of iHeart.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Too Much Information, the show that brings you the secret histories and fascinating facts and figures behind your favorite TV shows, movies, music, and more. We're your new order of nerds, your post-punk of provable trivia, your gloomy Englishmen of
entertainment.
And we're talking about gloomy Englishmen.
Yes.
I'm Alex Heigl.
And I'm Jordan Runtagh.
And Jordan, today we're talking about a debut album that defined an era, helped launch a new subgenre, and most importantly, created an entire cottage industry in t-shirts. That is right, we are talking about Joy Division's Unknown Pleasures. I discovered this album in high school, presumably after seeing the t-shirt. And it was such a revelation to me, because prior, like most of the other punk rock bands I knew about, I also learned about from t-shirts, like the Ramones, Misfits, Kennedys, Black Flag. And when you get those 4 t-shirt bands out of the way, and then you progress to another t-shirt band, Joy Division, I don't know why I pronounced it like that. I was like Matt Berry. I enjoy the works of Joy Division. Unknown Pleasures. It's such a departure. It sounds like a new horrifying alien world, and that's the gateway drug of post-punk. And then you're playing single note guitar lines and jagged atonal bass, and the drums suddenly get dancier, and the drawls become more disaffected, and then you're cooking with gas, baby. Getting a Gang of 4 wire, you get a geometric haircut. You have to buy a Jazzmaster, obviously. Anyway, I do not gather this band is your cup of tea.
Yeah, you were into t-shirt bands. I was into cardigan bands.
Yeah. Well, I mean,
neighbor jacket bands, and
I assume there's things that you find in it, right?
Yeah, I mean, I like them now, but my Joy Division origin story is not especially interesting or unique. They were, as you alluded to earlier, one of those bands that I was more aware of rather than actually had listened to because their iconography is so strong.
Sure. It's funny to me because I grew up in central Pennsylvania, much to my own tragedy. And I feel like
to my own regret.
Yes, much to my own regret. I was born and then grew up in central Pennsylvania. No, but I remember seeing Joy Division and nothing about New Order. Until Wikipedia, I think the only place I ever saw New Order glancingly mentioned was in the Rolling Stones that I were reading. And it was never enough to even be like, what is this band? Like, I was, honestly entirely old to be a music nerd and find out that New Order came from Joy Division. But I'm sorry, I cut you off.
No, I mean, growing up in the early 2000s was a funny time to be a burgeoning music fan, I think, because so many of these classic groups had been canonized already as t-shirt bands. But since this was the pre-streaming era, it was an investment to actually investigate their music further. So I think this was the prime era for band as fashion statement or social signifiers, at least in my high school. So to me, the Unknown Pleasures graphic was like the Nike swoosh for moody, depressed people at my school.
Yeah.
And honestly, the little bit of it that I had heard was kind of frightening to me. I mean, that doom and gloom of that haunted voice was then magnified tenfold when I learned about Ian Curtis's history. And then there's that story of his girlfriend saying that she had a hard time listening to Closer, his last album, because I think in her words, she said, he means it.
Oh,
it sounds he means it.
Yeah, that was his mistress. And she, that was her mistress. She contends their relationship was platonic, which I don't think anyone else does. But
I said girlfriend, yeah.
Well, without mentioning first that he was married with a daughter. But yeah, she.
But you know what I mean.
I do.
Listening to this, it suddenly takes on a level of gravitas that
it's perhaps the level of gravitas that any band could get from, like, you listen to Jim Morrison, but he's he's just singing about being horny and thinking and how cool he is, and then like, I don't know, you listen to Janis and it's like, what joie de vivre. Or Jimi Hendrix, and you're like, yeah, man, but he was just too far out in the sky. And then you listen to Joy Division and find out the guy killed himself, and you're like, yes, that seems exactly right.
I mean, it's kind of how I feel about Elliott Smith, too. I find him hard. I mean, I love Elliott Smith, I love Ian Curtis, but I find it difficult to listen to those albums for pleasure, frankly. I mean, I feel that way to a certain extent about Amy Winehouse and Janis Joplin because of the pain that they were so clearly in led them down the road of vices that ended up cutting their lives short.
I guess I just mean like upon immediate blush, like you are like, did this guy kill himself horribly?
Oh, yeah. Oh, sure.
And you're
okay,
like, yeah. No, that makes sense. I got that immediately.
Yeah. I found it hard to confront as a young music fan coming up. For somebody who existed in the Beach Boys, Beatles, Simon and Garfunkel, Zombies, Honey-Soaked Harmonies realm, going to Ian Curtis was just not a place I wanted to even visit.
No. Well, from this famous Sex Pistols concert in Manchester that launched several prominent bands and was attended by the members of Joy Division, to the borderline abusive recording situation that produced Unknown Pleasures, to the sad demise and rebirth of a band that made it, here is everything you didn't know about Joy Division's Unknown Pleasures. The album begins with what is generally considered to be the big bang of punk in the northern part of the UK. And I actually asked you this while I was writing it, but Jordan, where does the northern UK start? The North, as they refer to it?
I personally always thought it was the line demarcated by Liverpool, Manchester, and Sheffield. That's kind of on the same latitude.
They're north of Birmingham, right?
Yeah, they're north of Birmingham.
So I think it's Birmingham.
You think it's Birmingham? Okay.
Yeah, because they all talked about being, strong industrial Northmen. But
we have some. I just want to shout out our British fans. In addition to our friend John we mentioned earlier, we had a very lovely person who left us a review. Knackered head teacher, British and proud, she says. So thank you. Please get in touch. Find us on Twitter and let us know where the north of England starts.
Yes, I would genuinely be interested in learning that.
Yeah, thank you for that lovely note.
Mostly because the other thing that I brought up was because there's a scene in one of the Trip movies where Steve Coogan is arguing to an aghast Rob Brydon that the culture of the northern part of Britain is more distinct than that of Wales.
Yeah, that's 1,000% true.
Ooh, buddy.
Oh, I'm a Beatles guy. Come on. And an Oasis guy. And a Joy Division. Well, I'm not a Joy Division guy, but...
Yeah, but I mean, don't tell the Welsh that.
I mean,
they
got
will
Tom
beat your
Jones
ass while drinking more than you could even conceive was possible.
Oh, I don't think you want to challenge like Liverpudlians or Manx to a drinking contest.
I'm not saying they're not formidable. I'm just saying that like I don't think you can say that it's more recognized probably. I just don't agree that it's a more distinct culture than that of an entire island with its own language.
Wales isn't an island.
Shut up. Anyway, so yeah, the hardest music that they'd had up until this was probably Black Sabbath.
Yeah. Well, yeah.
Maybe did Zeppelin come through there? I can see a bunch of northern people like. Well,
I mean
that's
the Who live at Leeds. Come on, that's northern England.
That's also true. I guess that Anyway, so the Sex Pistols came up and played the Manchester Lesser Free Trade Hall, which does that presuppose the existence of a greater free trade hall?
I was Googling this before we came on because the Free Trade Hall is where Bob Dylan had his famous Judas concert when he went electric, and one of the fans shouted Judas at him for betraying his folk leanings. I couldn't figure out if there was a greater Free Trade Hall. I don't think so. But again, Brits listening, please get in touch.
Yeah, let us know. So this happened on June 4th, 1976. And so in a roundabout way, we actually owe Joy Division and many other Manchester bands' existence to another Manchester band, the Buzzcocks. Joy Division and New Order guitarist Bernard Sumner, Barney, as he does not like to be called, but I will call him that.
Yeah, so you're a Peter Hook guy, I imagine?
Of course I'm a Peter Hook guy.
That makes sense.
He's disputed this. He said he'd already started playing guitar and was looking around for a band before the Lesser Free Trade Hall show. But Sex Pistols and punk in general had yet to become a universal concern in February of 1976. But they had gotten enough press in the UK trades that these two young gentlemen from Manchester named Howard Devoto and Pete Shelley decided to go down to London to catch this band. And sufficiently repulsed, awed, inspired, Devoto and Shelley made two epical moves. They invited the Sex Pistols to come to Manchester and play the aforementioned Lesser Free Trade Hall, and they formed their own band called the Buzzcocks, or just Buzzcocks. I've never been entirely sure.
I think it's just Buzzcocks. Well, wait a minute. No, there's the great
'Cause there's a TV
British,
show.
British TV. Yeah, never mind the
Yeah.
Buzzcocks. One of my favorite shows. Simon Amstel's hilarious. Look it up on YouTube.
News of the Sex Pistols show in Manchester spread by word of mouth. So it was a very unattended gig. I believe legend holds that around 40 people showed up for it. But much like the classic Velvet Underground quote about everyone seeing them forming band, not many people saw them, but everyone who did formed a band. A handful of people in attendance at this 40-strong gig did change the course of music history. Devoto and Shelley, obviously having the Buzzcocks going, they're basically described as one of the architects of pop punk and or power pop, them along with Big Star, arguably the most melodically skilled and arrangement-wise skilled of any of that era, except for maybe The Clash. But I would argue that like the Buzzcocks on Singles Going Steady have like already a precocious grasp of like pop songwriting and melody in a way that the Clash at the same time did not. Man, Buzzcocks are great. Marky Smith was also in attendance there, and he formed The Fall, one of the UK's longest-lasting and influential punk bands, with a roster that swelled to 66 members before Smith died in 2018. He was famous for saying, "If it's me and your granny on bongos, it's The Fall." And he was an awful person. He was a real piece of shit, and I find The Fall unlistenable. So there's that. But he's hilarious.
Which is funny considering he's the lead-in for another prodigious soul in rock named
Stephen Patrick Morrissey. Yeah. You know, just a guy who co-founded the Smiths with another Mancunian, far more talented than he, and interesting and nice, named Johnny Marr. I love Johnny Marr. I've often said that if somebody wanted to put together like non-vocal versions of the Smith songs as a box set, I would buy it.
Oh wow. I'm sure we could like do that. I'm sure there's somebody on YouTube that
some audio engineer wants to do that for me. I will Venmo you $5.
Do you ever interview him?
Morrissey? No, dude. Since I was like 19, I decided I never wanted to be in the room with that man.
No, Johnny Marr.
Oh, Johnny Marr? No, I would love to. But it would just be like 40 minutes of me being like, so how close were the 4 amps that you used to record How Soon Is Now? What was their exact miking placement? That actually might be There's a Light That Never Goes Out. I forget my Johnny Marr guitar apocrypha. Tony Wilson, the Manchester TV news presenter who'd go on to launch the careers of Joy Division and also start the record label Factory Records, which is the label that is basically, responsible for the Manchester music scene, right? Throughout the 80s, 90s. I mean, short order, they produced Joy Division, New Order, the Durutti Column, I believe.
I think
and
so,
then
yeah.
Later, Happy Mondays.
And all the Hacienda stuff. Played by Steve Coogan in 24 Hour Party People.
Yes.
Friend of the pod, Steve Coogan.
And of course, the four of the subjects of this podcast, Ian Curtis, Bernard Sumner, Peter Hook, who would buy his first bass the day after seeing this concert, and Martin Hannett, the producer who would help Joy Division craft their inimitable sound. Pistols returned to the North a month later, visiting Sheffield with 2 other bands you may have heard of, Theatrical Punksters The Damned, and a scrappy little band of upstarts called The Clash. And then they would play the Lesser Free Trade Hall 3 weeks after that, now drawing hundreds to the venue. It is important to note just how damn depressing Manchester was in this era. Until the Great Depression, it was a known hub for textile, chemical, and electrical production. And then during World War III, Mancunian factories were repurposed to produce aircraft.
World War what?
World War III? And then during World War II...
I'm getting something in my ear right now. Wait a minute. Take shelter. And then
during World War II, the Mancunian factories were repurposed to produce aircraft, which made them a very attractive target for the German Luftwaffe during the Blitz. The city sustained incredibly heavy damage, and many of its factories moved overseas after the war, and things got worse during the 70s thanks to good old Maggie Hatcher, who's now shoveling coal in hell. And then many of the iconic musicians from this era grew up amid the literal rubble of the Blitz because a lot of this stuff just didn't get repaired or fixed. So they were like playing amongst the bombed out ruins of their city and grew up in the government subsidized council housing, aka the council flats.
Did I ever tell you I'm going to burn any bit of goodwill we have with the UK audience right now? Did I ever tell you my aunt was friends with Margaret Thatcher?
That reflects poorly on your bloodline. My favorite quote about her is from a Scottish comic who I forget, but it was like...
It's got to be Frankie Boyle.
Was it?
It's got to be Frankie Boyle.
He was like, her state funeral cost 16 million pounds. For the price of that, you could have bought every Scotsman a shovel and we would have dug a tunnel so deep, you could have handed her off to Satan himself.
Yeah, I think that was got to be Frankie Boyle. He's so good.
Yeah, she sucks. What were we talking about?
We are talking about Kevin Curtis.
The
anti-Margaret Thatcher, known to his friends as the anti-Margaret Thatcher. He was born on July 15th, 1956, the first of two children in a working-class Macclesfield household. He quickly showed an interest in the life of the mind. That's a beautiful statement. Thank you for writing that.
That's from Barton Fink.
Oh, yeah.
I will show you the life of the mind. Running down an on-fire hallway with a shotgun. Everyone go watch Barton Fink. It's a great movie.
It is one of my favorite Coen Brothers movies. He was particularly fascinated by poetry, and by age 11, he'd snagged a place in the Macclesfield Boys' Grammar School called the King's School. He picked up several awards at the school while developing his interest in philosophy, literature, and poetry, and also began some of his more stereotypically punkish tendencies at this time, like shoplifting records and stealing pills from the elderly he was visiting as part of a school program, the result of which necessitated hospitalization at least once. Wow, that kind of stuff they're handing out at old people's homes in the late 60s in England.
I find the Joy Division story compelling because they were all like involved and they all had day jobs until like 6 months before they stopped being a band. Like they were all involved in various like council hall and like city hall government programs. Just these like nice quaint little manx going down to the pub after a 9 to 5 and then going to produce like some of the most sepulchral music ever. Sepulchral.
Sad. After a brief stint in college, Ian Curtis dropped out and began working at a record store in Manchester, later joining, as you mentioned, the civil service. He also managed to get married to his childhood sweetheart at age 19, and the two had their only child, Natalie, a few years later.
Yes, and that brings us to guitarist Barney Sumner. Born 6 months before Curtis, grew up in the Manchester suburb of Broughton, educated at the Salford Grammar School. He would join the minorly famous Manchester-based animation studio Stop Frame, then it was called Cosgrove Hall Films, as an animator. That was an early day job for old Barney. He was an animator on children's properties, such as Jamie and the Magic Torch. The company is best known today for the spy parody Danger Mouse, which was a James Bond parody starring a mouse, a stop-motion version of The Wind in the Willows, and perhaps more appropriately for a future member of Joy Division, Count Duckula.
Here, I feel bad taking Peter Hook. I know he's your guy. Take Peter Hook next.
Oh, man. I mean, Peter Hook, what do you say about him? An iconic rock star, like a bastard.
A world-class grouch.
A laddish man, nonpareil. Born in 1956, he was in the same outlying Manchester suburb as Sumner. His given name was Woodhead. His parents divorced when he was 3 years old, which is no mean feat in 1959 England. And Peter wound up taking his new stepfather's surname. I was just reading how also thanks to his new dad, he got to spend some time in Jamaica. And I cannot imagine a harder come down than returning to 60s, 70s Manchester after seeing Jamaica. Like, good Christ.
Why was he taken to Jamaica?
I don't know.
Oh. No, I mean, that was
I guess
trying
his
to get
dad
you.
was doing some kind of petrochemical or maybe destabilizing the government. I don't know. Like, what was the UK's? What would have brought an Englishman to Jamaica? Any number of things.
I love this. Peter Hook and Bernard Sumner, who would go on to become some of the fiercest bitter rivals in music history.
God, they hate each other.
Yeah, so much. They first crossed paths at grammar school as students, and they were drawn together initially by a love of scooters, which actually played a role in their first falling out. According to Peter Hook's hilarious and absurdly vindictive memoir, Unknown Pleasures, he and Bernie were on a scooter trip in southern France as kids, and one of their friends crashed his bike and needed some extra cash to make it home. Hook writes, "Let's just say when it came to helping out, Barney wasn't very helpful. After that, I couldn't really look at him the same way." Have you read this book?
I haven't, actually.
Oh, dude,
I know it's one of your favorites.
It's up there with like Levon Helm's memoir in terms of just pure venom.
Yeah.
And my favorite part of the book is when he describes Bernie Sumner thus: "Whoever it was that said no man is an island never met Bernard." It's so good. Everyone check that book out. Though Sumner and Hook formed what would become Joy Division with a different drummer, Terry Mason, the band went through a number of replacements until cementing their classic lineup with drummer Stephen Morris, the baby of the group, having been born in 1957, a year after everyone else. Stephen Morris grew up in nearby Macclesfield with a dad who helped organize concerts in the area. And when a young Morris expressed his interest in drumming, Morris Sr. told him, "Drummers, Stephen, I've never met a sane one yet. They all end up taking morphine and drinking absinthe, rotting their brains." Spot the lie. Are there any bands where the drummer's like the stable member? I mean, flip side, Keith Moon, no. John Bonham, no.
Yeah, you know who
Dennis
it is?
Wilson, the Beach Boys, no. Who?
It's fucking Don Henley.
Oh, yeah.
Who, like,
okay.
a tremendous piece
Yeah.
of shit, but also, like, the guiding hand behind that at all times. But yeah, I had this...
Ringo's pretty stable.
Not in the 80s.
Oh, yeah, that's true. Strike that.
Yeah, I don't know. I have this theory that it's because in developing the limb independence to play the drums, they lose a part of their brain, like impulse control or
wow.
Like it's, I don't know. We gotta crack one of them open and do some tests.
Is there like an Oliver Sacks book on that? Didn't he write a book like Musicalia or something?
Musicophilia.
Like,
Yeah, that's a tremendous book.
Yeah.
Yeah. Like the guy who was struck by lightning and developed an insatiable urge to play and compose concert piano despite never having touched the instrument in his life.
That's cool. Is that the same book that has the story about the guy who had some kind of aphasia where he had some kind of traumatic brain injury and the speech portion of his brain was damaged, so he learned how to speak again through singing because it was a different part of the brain?
Oh, I don't know. That doesn't come to mind, but that is very interesting. I believe I've traumatized you before with one of my favorite avant-garde vocalists, Diamanda Gallet or Galaz.
I don't remember that.
I don't know how to pronounce her name because I've only ever seen it printed, but she is sort of a proto-lingua ignota, I would say, or Kristen Hayter. She performs on piano and has like the most insane, outrageous, like extended range and extended techniques with her voice. Like she's got a tremendously like beautiful traditional voice, but she also goes into like roars and snarls and like almost glossolalia, like speaking in tongues kind of stuff. And I mean, she's like literally contributed to soundtracks where she is playing a demon. But she's a fascinating artist. I really do. Go look up her cover of I Put a Spell on You. It is...
What's her name?
Diamanda Gallet?
Yes.
Gala, with like an accent over the A. She's Greek, so I don't know how you pronounce that. And so she actually studied a lot of techniques from this guy, this Austrian guy named Alfred Wolfson. Sorry, German. And he worked with a lot of World War I veterans who were like haunted by everything that they'd seen, or they'd actually had their vocals damaged by mustard gas. And so he developed all of it. He was actually a stretcher bearer when he was 18, which is horrifying. And so, you know, part of his PTSD was like hearing people scream persistently. And he cured himself of that by like having these moments of tremendous vocal catharsis where he was just like scream singing. And he, put this into, codified this as like a system and a method, and he became a singing teacher and a psychotherapist. And, when he was working with people and it was therapeutic for soldiers and everything, but when like actual singers started to learn this stuff, it would like unlock unnatural registers in their voice and let them do all these things that were like kind of not traditionally thought capable, essentially, the way that they were using their voice. So she was big into him. And then how did we get into that?
I mean, that's so interesting, though. I mean, I had a really good friend who would go to vocal coaches basically as a form of therapy to heal, emotional trauma, essentially. And they're studying to be a psychotherapist now. It's interesting, the link between, I mean, obviously we know the link between mind and body is so strong, but I hadn't really thought much about the link between voice and psychological healing. It's really interesting to me. I hadn't really made that connection until very recently.
There's all this crazy stuff about focal dystonia. Have you ever heard?
No, what's that?
Heard about that? That is I think it's neurological. This is like the nerdiest thing that could possibly ever say to you, but I know it because of an online base teaching website that I am a member of. Not to teach, but to like take lessons. Scott's Bass Lessons.
Oh, hell yeah. I know Scott's Bass Lessons.
Oh, hell yeah. Yeah. Scott Devine. Pluk, 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 slide. Anyway, he wears a glove while he plays bass. And it's like before he became like truly famous, people were always like, why do you wear that glove? And he's like, well, I have focal dystonia. And like, it's a neurological condition that they don't really know what causes it. And it just like misfires your muscle contractions. So it causes involuntary muscle contractions that obviously make it very difficult for musicians in particular with their voice and with hands. It could have to do with overtraining and stressing, but they also think it could be genetic. Like they really don't know. And they're just like, sometimes they're like, well, yeah, sometimes your body just stops working that certain way. And like, there's no real cure for it other than like a lot of therapy and learning to work with it. Fascinating and horrifying the ways in which our bodies work.
Yep.
Anyway.
It's a theme of this episode, the ways that your body can sort of fail you in spectacular ways.
Yeah, I really should have taken that event before this. Morris, Sumner, and Hook placed a want ad for a singer in the Manchester Virgin Records store. Ian Curtis, who was a known quantity from sort of the local music scene, responded and was hired without an audition based on his vibes. That is not an exaggeration. Bernard Sumner literally said, we would just hire people based on whether or not we got along with them. While both the Buzzcocks manager Richard Boone and the frontman of that band Pete Shelley have been credited with suggesting the band's original name, Stiff Kittens, pretty good.
I mean, yeah, but it would just change the whole vibe.
Oh, yeah. It's 110% like a shitty first wave UK punk name.
I mean, imagine like the Closer album cover with like the tomb
Stiff Kittens
with Stiff Kittens listed, but like it doesn't work.
Yeah, they initially decided on Warsaw, which was a reference to David Bowie's song Warsawa.
I think so.
Which is off low. It's an instrumental track, which
big bummer.
Yeah, bummer song. Is that the one that they parody in that animated thing where Brian Eno's like, he's like, David, I've just come up with this an instrumental thing while we're producing your record Low. If you don't like it, I'll just stick on one of my weird albums or something. And then he plays it for David Bowie and he says, well, it's a rivetingly depressing piece of music, Brian. I'll probably just free associate some made up language gibberish over the top so people won't think I've stolen it from you.
It was that, yeah.
That guy's Bowie impression is so good.
It is.
What is it? I have to find it now just so.
No, it is that song because
shout it out.
Warsaw
Yeah, I want to find
him.
what it's called. Bowie, also co-producer Tony Visconti probably doing a lot more than people realize on this record. Adam Buxton is the comedian. Who's
another great British panel show veteran.
Yes.
It's a very good podcast, too.
Oh, okay. Good for him. Friend of the pod, Adam Buxton. Warsaw played their first show in May of 1977. They were first wave punk, basically. Short a few days of being exactly 1 year after that Sex Pistols gig. And they were supporting the Buzzcocks. And their drummer for the night was a guy named Tony Tabak. Tabak, who joined the band 2 days earlier. A month later, they replaced him with a guy named Steve Brotherdale, who hilariously spent the entire tenure in the band trying to get Ian Curtis to join his other band called Panic. Because of this ironic lack of brotherhood, the nascent Joy Division fired Brotherdale in a cruelly non-confrontational fashion. On the way back from recording some demos, they pulled over, asked him to step out of the car to check a flat tire, and drove away.
Isn't that like basically what Metallica did to Dave Mustaine?
I think you would know that better than I would from your work on Rivals, but I think they just like left him somewhere.
Oh, you're right. They
and
did. They
he had
did
to like
just
get
leave
a
him.
bus back.
Yes, that was what it was. Yeah, I mean it's only slightly less humane than the Syd Barrett move of just like not picking him up at his house one day.
Or like, well, that's what Neil Young did to Bruce Barry, right? He like shipped him home with like pay in the middle of a tour, and Barry overdosed like 3 days later.
Yeah, but I think that was like you're not in any condition to be playing right now. Here, go get well.
Yeah, take all this cash and go back to your home base where you score all your drugs.
Which was LA, I believe.
Surely this will turn out well for you. I'm Neil Young.
There's definitely like a listicle out there of like worst ways bands have fired a member.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
I'm trying to think of what else.
I don't care. Things happened quickly for the band after that. Stephen Morris, who would go on to earn the nickname The Human Drum Machine for his unerring precision and verve, responded to their ad in August of 1977, which is fortunate because I have read that he was the only person who did so. And the band changed their name in early 1978 to avoid confusion with the London punk band Warsaw Pact. They went with a pretty dire source for the new one. Joy Division was, as is often mentioned, a sexual slavery wing connected to the Nazis' concentration camps. They essentially abducted or just took women from within the camps and put them into forced sexual slavery, largely servicing other camp members who were all non-Jewish, who were like co-conspirators or like had been somehow elevated in the ranks of prisoners. They were at Auschwitz, Bergen, Buchenwald, and Dachau, so, you know, all the worst ones. And according to Joseph Kohut, an Austrian Nazi concentration camp survivor imprisoned for being gay, Himmler mandated weekly visits to the Freudenabteilungen for gay prisoners, which Himmler intended to cure them of their homosexuality with. The band learned about this via camp survivor and author Heigl Feiner's 1955 novella House of Dolls.
This is somehow not the worst Nazi-related British band name of the era.
Yeah, educate us about Spandau Ballet.
Yeah, well, actually, I was doing this off the dome. I want to make sure this is actually right. Okay, it has been scrubbed from their Wikipedia page. Yes, Spandau Ballet, I have heard referred to the final jerky moments of Nazi prisoners of war being hung for their crimes. That was their bodies dangling, spasming in their last moments of life. Spandau Ballet, I know this much is true.
The Joy Division recorded their...
Back to something happier. Joy Division, quick.
Well, I was going to say, imagine if they'd gone with Freudenabteilungen. They recorded their debut EP, An Ideal for Living, in December of 1977, and played their first gig under their new name in January of 1978. The cover of the EP, with its illustration of a Hitler Youth member, did not ease tensions over their name. Things continued to happen for them, though. Truly one of the most rocket ride, to fame. A band by 1977, famous by like late 1979, and done by early 1980. Anyway, in April of 78, they had caught the eye of the aforementioned TV presenter Tony Wilson, along with another Mancunian named Rob Gretton, who had become their new manager and a hugely important part of why they became successful. This guy was like their biggest champion. According to legend, a drunken Ian Curtis berated Tony Wilson for not putting them on So It Goes. I have also heard that he wrote a scathing letter. And Wilson responded and said that Joy Division would be the next band that he would showcase on TV. They self-released this troublingly titled EP in June of 1978 and made their television debut that September. Joy Division's first encounter then with the infamous producer Martin Hannett. You know what's funny? I actually heard Martin Hannett's name first in a Dead Kennedys song in their song Nazi Punk Off, which is one of their later era songs. By later, I mean like 80 or 81 instead of 77. But it has a bit of studio chatter with Jello Biafra going, overproduced by Martin Hannett. He was a hard ass in the studio. Anyway, their first encounter with him came via a compilation double 7-inch EP from Tony Wilson's new label, Factory Records. It was in fact the first release on Factory in October of 78. From the strength of this TV appearance, they received a few offers from major labels, but decided to opt for the nascent upstart label in promise of a better financial split and more creative freedom. This would come back to bite all of them in the ass because Tony Wilson was an awful, awful businessman. Martin Hannett was a self-taught audio nerd who had a degree in chemistry and came to engineering from doing live sound for concerts. He landed his place in punk history for recording the first independently released punk record, the Buzzcocks Spiral Scratch EP. Oh, people forget that for all of punk's vying claims for independence, you know, the Ramones were on Sire and Sex Pistols were on EMI. Yeah, real hard scrabble lads there. God, I hate the Sex Pistols.
I didn't know that. I didn't know that.
Them. Yeah. Johnny Lydon's an edge case as far as like PIL, but he just sucks so hard. And all of them sucked so hard. They were just like the worst group of kids.
As musicians or people or both?
Both. Yeah. I find nothing interesting about them other than the fact that they suck.
But that sometimes that's enough though. I mean,
they were, you know what they were? They were like the archetypal. They were like,
did they not suck interestingly?
No.
Like the Fugs?
I mean, their music is like so boring. It's pub rock. It's just like boring ass. Like it's pub rock. You know, they fired the only guy in the band who was good at music, Glenn Matlock, and then literally hired a guy based on his image who could not play bass. Period. Sid Vicious could not play bass. They were all like violent men, possibly, you know, like all sexual predators, given the tenor of the times. And yeah, dude, they were a boy band. Like Martin McLaren just shoved them together based on thinking that he could sell them as an image, you know? Like, yeah. Also, they were directly influenced by the Ramones, which forever settles the issue of the U.S. Like they learned from the Ramones' self-titled debut. So the U.S. invented punk. I'm sorry to those of the UK who were clinging on to that last thing that your country did. Thanks to our listeners in the UK.
Yeah, I was going to say, this is the episode especially for our new UK friends. No, it wasn't.
Anyway, yeah, his other stuff is super weird. He, a Manchester comic named Graham David Fellows had a hit called Jilted John, which, do you know anything about that?
Nope.
I think it's like a comedy record that Martin Hannett produced. And he also did some records with this punk poet guy named John Cooper Clarke, who was just doing like spoken word over Martin Hannett's weird electronic sounds and like bass playing.
Sounds awful.
Yeah.
Even I can't put a good face to that.
No. Also, I think at one point in, is it 24-Hour Party People that he's like played by Andy Serkis, and when they bury him, they're like, he was too fat for his f***ing coffin or something. Like they say something awful about him.
Martin Hannett?
Yeah.
Because he died super young. His gravestone has the architect of the Manchester Sound engraved on it, I think. He died at like age 42 or something, presumably of, if it wasn't a direct overdose, just from excessive alcohol and drug use, I believe. Yeah. Yes.
We're going to take a quick break, but we'll be right back with more Too Much Information in just a moment.
Well, before Joy Division stepped into the studio to record Unknown Pleasures with Martin Hannett, 3 landmarks in the band's history occurred. Number 1, in December of 1978, Ian Curtis had his first recognized severe epileptic seizure. Curtis had actually probably developed the disease a long time before this. His wife, Deborah, remembered that as early as 1972, he would report having sensations of floating. You wrote, while sorbet. Is that a typo? I like it.
It is. No, while sober.
Oh, while sober. Okay.
But possibly while making sorbet. What a delicious
Enjoying
wrinkle.
sorbet.
A delicious wrinkle on the Joy Division mythos. Ian Curtis, a devoted fan of sorbet.
I can't read this next part while laughing. Jesus Christ. And then he collapsed on a venue floor after prolonged exposure to a strobe light. Prior to his diagnosis, most of these incidents were chalked up to drugs and alcohol, but Curtis received an official diagnosis of epilepsy in January 1979, with the horrifying prediction from doctors that without medication, quote, his life would be ruled to obsolescence by a severe epilepsy.
A horrible thing to say to your patient.
Epilepsy's so goddamn scary.
Oh, yeah.
I know very little about it.
It's the 2 halves of your brain stop communicating well. I believe, but am not entirely sure that it's from my high school psych class, that one of the first big insights into epilepsy came from that guy who got the steel rod jammed up his face.
Oh, Phineas Gage?
Yes, Phineas Gage, our boy Phineas Gage.
Friend of the pod, Phineas Gage.
Phineas Gage. Oh, Jesus Christ. The first
you
photo
saw the
that comes
picture?
up of him is,
no.
him holding the iron rod that went through his face and separated the halves of his brain.
So he was a railroad worker, right? And the railroad spike went down the hole and something exploded and it shot up through. That was it?
Yeah. It like went through the lower half of his jaw and came out the top head of his brain, but it severely
it severed
it severed the 2 halves of his brain essentially, and that was like an early understanding of how the brain worked for us, because his personality like changed drastically, and it gave it was like a landmark case in our understanding of how mental illness or any kind of affliction of the brain was governed by how the 2 halves work together.
Did his personality change? Was he just like, holy shit, a spike just went through my head, I'm going to do things differently?
According to Wikipedia, the effects were sufficiently profound that his friends saw him as, quote, no longer Gage.
Oh, how long did he live after that?
12 years after that.
Wow. That is horrifying. When was that? Like turn of the century? Like late 1800s?
Early 1800s.
Oh my God.
The incident occurred in 1848.
Oh my God. Wow. I didn't realize it was that early.
Yeah, I don't actually believe they made any. I don't want to misrepresent him as being like some kind of epilepsy forebearer, but it was like our understanding of how epilepsy does occur was informed by his case.
That is wild. Wow.
At least as I was educated in central Pennsylvania, which again, I regret from a high school psychology class. I actually read a little bit about the history of epilepsy treatment and like diagnosis to get some context for this. And it doesn't go back that far. They like really had not developed treatments beyond like incredibly invasive surgery and like a battery of truly horrifying drugs by the time Curtis was dealing with it.
Was Neil Young epileptic?
No, he had polio and autism. I mean, he might be lying about that because it's something you don't like grow out of. So if Neil Young at any point was like, I had epilepsy, remember our friend of a friend in our People days who said, Neil lies like he breathes.
I think he had epileptic seizures.
I guess so.
One of the best known singers with epilepsy, Neil Young's a rock legend.
All right,
Young
fine.
he's been very open about his life with epilepsy, which he describes in his memoir. He developed epilepsy as an adult in 1966 and once told a journalist that a seizure felt like, quote, you slip into some other world. In December 1978, Ian Curtis was prescribed phenobarbital to combat his seizures, but when they continued to occur, he was subsequently given phenytoin.
Phenytoin.
Phenytoin, Carbanza, Carba. He was given some other stuff. Owing to the group's heavy performance schedule and equally heavy drinking and drugging, Curtis would lose track of which drug he was supposed to be on at any given time. And unfortunately, one of the well-diagnosed side effects of phenobarbital is depression. So all in all, this is not good for Ian Curtis.
It's just so tragic, man. I mean, it was definitely a combination of like Northern UK, like man culture of like never talking about your problems and self-medicating. I mean, he did drugs and drank to like both this part of the culture, but like also to like numb all of this horror and pain. And, you know, also being a musician is just bad for you because you're supposed to get like a lot of good sleep, regular sleep, and like eschew alcohol and drugs and all of that stuff if you have epilepsy. Anyway, a few weeks after that, Joy Division landed the January 13th of NME and recorded their de rigueur event in the life of an upcoming punk band, the Peel Session, also that month. And 3 months later, they entered Strawberry Studios, founded by members of 10cc in Stockport with Martin Hannett. Jordan, just give us a thumbnail sketch of John Peel and the Peel Sessions.
Oh, John Peel, legendary English DJ, one of the founding members of BBC Radio 1 in 1967. He was a veteran of the pirate stations before that, who were like, you know, UK didn't have commercial radio. So the pirate stations were basically the only radio networks in the early 60s who played like pop music all the time. Otherwise, it was strictly limited on BBC radio waves. So when he came aboard to BBC Radio 1, which was the UK's first real dedicated pop network, he was like, he had the cool cred because he was on the pirate stations and he ran late night shows. I think called Top Gear was one. The Perfumed Garden was another in the late 60s. And anyway, he was famous for having bands on. He's famous for a couple of things. He was famous for playing kind of the weirder, like FM before FM was a thing, like the kind of weirder stuff. And then he would have bands on for these sessions. He would have them play like in studio concerts. And it became a real like rite of passage for breaking bands. He was like a big, probably one of the preeminent people who broke punk in the UK, I would have to say. Yeah. The Undertones was one of his favorite bands.
Yeah,
Teenage Kicks, great song. Yeah, Teenage Kicks so hard to beat. So yeah, he was just like the preeminent tastemaker of UK music from the late 60s through, probably through to his death in 2004. I mean, any of our UK listeners keep me humble there, but pretty undiminished. The guy had some heaters through to his death.
He sure did, Jordan. Stephen Morris told British GQ that his first impression of Martin Hannett was Joe Meek combined with Tom Baker period Doctor Who, which Bernard Sumner echoed. It's true Martin did look like Tom Baker from Doctor Who, but you'd have to add some serious drugs to the equation as well. He was basically Doctor Who on drugs.
That's quite an image. And also Joe Meek is not a very flattering comparison.
Yeah, you don't tell people that someone is like Joe Meek.
Yeah, Joe Meek, for non-60s Britpop mega nerds like us, he's basically like the UK's answer to Phil Spector. He built a home studio in his apartment and did early experiments with tape technology that basically amounted to these spacey, haunting pop records.
Telstar.
Well, Telstar, yeah, which I believe was the first UK song to go #1 in the United States. And he also has a very, very fascinating album called I Hear a New World, which is a pioneering concept album, techno work.
Tell you one thing, his landlady heard some new worlds.
Oh. Yes, unfortunately, these achievements are overshadowed by the fact that he was dealing with some serious undiagnosed mental issues and ended up shooting his landlady to death before turning the rifle on himself in 1967. So yeah, not exactly a flattering comparison for Joy Division producer Martin Hannett.
And from that first impression, things only deteriorated. Hannett was just a super dick to them, and I think he called the band like a producer's dream because they were all so young and inexperienced that he would just frequently tell them to shut the up and leave him alone. And he was also perpetually stoned on weed, heroin, uppers, often drunk. Peter Hook recalled, in the studio, we'd sit on the left, he'd sit on the right, and if we said anything like, I think the guitars are a bit quiet, Martin, he'd scream, oh my God, why don't you just f*** off?
To be fair, that sounds like something you would do when you were annoyed with us.
It's true. And I was also frequently messed up. Hannett's instruction to the band while tracking, which took 2 days. They did basic tracks on a Saturday, and then overdubs on a Sunday, and then the rest of it was like mixing. The album was done in like a matter of days. But his instructions to them were vague and pseudo-mystical in nature. Be magnificent, but humble. That also sounds like a Matt Berry thing.
Yes.
Be magnificent, but humble. Or that he would tell them to do it again, but more cocktail party.
I like that.
Or more yellow.
I really like that.
And he once asked for another take. Slower, but faster. And it would do things like listen to mixes from under the console. And when he got tired of the band, he would literally freeze them out by cranking the AC down or up. I've never understood how that works. To untenable levels of freezing. Hook wrote in his memoir that there were obviously no such thing as click tracks or backing tracks in those days. So they would just go in, bang out the tracks. Ian would be in the room, but he would do the vocal in isolation later.
I just have to retell the famous story, speaking of outrageous musical descriptions, of how John Lennon would convey what he wanted to hear to Beatles producer George Martin. There's a great piece on Vulture about just all the most like ridiculous things that John Lennon told George Martin. For the benefit of Mr. Kite, he told George Martin that he wanted it to, quote, sounds like an orange.
Yeah.
Martin recalled this in Mark Lewison's 1988 book, The Complete Beatles Recording Sessions. John had said he wanted to smell the sawdust on the floor, wanted to taste the atmosphere of the circus. For the climax to A Day in a Life, he wanted a sound, quote, like the end of the world, which I'd have to argue that George Martin delivered.
A C chord?
No, the whole like crescendo.
I know. But isn't it just like the piano chord is just like a boatload of C chords on like 4 pianos, right?
I think it's an E.
Sorry.
Checkmate.
Yeah.
Do it.
Off.
Do it.
Off. You have to do it in the John Hurt voice. Fuck off.
Ever I Am the Walrus, George Martin recalled John asking, I'd like for you to do a score and use some brass and some strings and some weird noises. You know the kind of thing I want. But, as George Martin recalled, I didn't. I just went away and did what I did. And for Tomorrow Never Knows, John wanted to sound like 1,000 monks chanting, even though he was only one of him.
Tom Waits would do this kind of shit too. He would like, if I recall correctly, some of his advice was like, play it like your hair is on fire, which is a good one.
And then there's Becker and Fagan from Steely Dan, who would just tell their guitar soloists, play the blues.
Or just, no, that wasn't it. That wasn't it either. No, do another one. All right, thanks for coming in. Love the Dan.
Yes. Martin Hannett reserved most of his abuse, however, for Stephen Morris, the drummer. He was actually quite enthralled with Morris's ability to play fast and repetitively without error, but he seemed to take this as a license to put him through all kinds of abuse while recording, like, allegedly, for legal reasons, well, he's dead, we don't care, like forcing him to...
One person said this wasn't true in the band, but it's also in, I think it's part of it is in the movie Control,
yes.
The Anton Corbijn movie. Corbijn.
He supposedly forced him to record the drums for She's Lost Control on the roof of the studio, which must have been freezing, I assume. He reportedly made Morris dismantle his entire kit down to the screws because he said he heard something rattling inside. To this day, the surviving members of Joy Division don't seem to know if this was true or one of Hannett's psychological games. Jesus Christ.
Yeah, I mean, his whole thing was isolation in the drums. He wanted everything to be, I guess because he had such ambitious designs on how he was going to treat them with reverb and delay, he wanted them each part as clean as possible. And so he put Stephen Morris through the, I have to imagine, insanity-inducing trial of literally recording the drums one at a time. So, normally when you play a drum set, you play all of the parts at a single time, as the instrument mandates. But Hannett had Stephen Morris sit there and just go through an entire take playing just one of the tom parts, then just another tom part, then just the snare part.
I don't even. I mean,
etc.
that's like playing piano one finger at a time. Like I can't.
Yeah, it's
like,
nuts.
I don't even understand how that would even lock together.
And Morris would just like he did it by, I guess, imagining and hearing and then playing the other drum parts on his legs, like with his sticks to keep time while he just like did a kick pedal or waited for like one tom hit to come up. But he said he wound up just bruised all over his thighs because of like a day or hours of doing this.
That's horrifying.
It is.
Oh my God.
That would make me so insane.
Just even trying to think about
that. How do you visualize a one tom hit coming up in your song?
I mean, it almost be one thing if you just dampen everything, and so you continue to sort of play it or hit it or whatever, and then have the one thing. But I can imagine that was a luxury that was not afforded to him.
And that's what rules about Stephen Morris, man. I mean, I mentioned his nickname earlier, but the human drum machine. But he is just like a phenom. The other person who vies to that title is Jackie Liebzek something from Cannes, who was like a big influence actually on Stephen Morris. But he took it so much further, especially in the New Order stuff, where it's like he's just keeping time with like sequencers and like synth parts, like just absolutely playing drum machine parts, and so damn fast. Did I paste this in here later?
I think so, yeah.
Oh, okay, yeah. Like Transmission, that song is bonkers fast, and he's just playing 16th notes on the hi-hat the entire time. He must have been on speed.
And hilariously, he looks like Artie, the strongest man in the world. He looks just like him.
Yeah,
he adds so much to this anecdote.
What a sweet boy.
Yeah. Hannett's quest for weird sounds led him to record the sound of the elevator in the building with a rotating Leslie speaker placed inside, and also the band breaking milk bottles in the studio, and in one case, placing Stephen Morris in a potentially fatal situation when he asked him to overdub some drum hits on She's Lost Control with a can of aerosol tape cleaner discharged in time with the hits. Can you hear that?
I mean, you can actually. That's what's fucking amazing about all of this. Like, it's why those snare parts in that song sound like they're sampled. They sound like the sound that you would get. Yes, exactly.
Yeah,
they sound like what you would later get in a number of years from like the Lynn drum, from Roland, the sound of the closed hi-hats that you hear on all that early hip hop stuff. And Hannett was hearing it years earlier and was just like, don't worry, I'll just compromise the drummer's physical health to get that song.
Yes, as Morris recalled, it was absolutely stupid, because it's just playing one of those snare drum parts, and Martin made me go into a vocal booth with a can of tape head cleaner, which is highly flammable and poisonous. So I'm in this confined space that's slowly filling up, and I come out of it completely dazed. If I'd lit a cigarette, that whole place would have gone up.
That is so nuts. I mean, just like, yeah, literally breathing toxic fumes just to get a specific snare sound. But, it is just impossible to overstate how important Hannett was for crafting this sound. I mean, and then you get everything from post-punk, except for Susie Sue, who was like a contemporary with them. And I guess maybe The Cure. The Cure started, I think, also contemporaneously around this time in Bauhaus. But like when you think of like the sound of post-punk records, that's like sort of very clinical and icy and pristine, but at the same time, it sounds like it's recorded very high fidelity, but in a very spooky cave. That makes sense?
Yeah, very much.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, the Joy Division were a first wave punk band. Their early gigs were just like volume, and especially parts of that I troublingly titled EP. And then Hannett found like these ways to just completely invert the entire concept of punk as it currently was, just on its head. He took all of these guitar parts. Like, you think of punk, you think of like Marshall's amps cranked, right? Like that's the Sex Pistols sound, that's the the Ramones sound. And he just took Barney's guitar and made it as tinny and like echoey and backgrounded it essentially, and draping it in plate reverb and treating it with weird pans. I mean, Sumner at the time was a pretty guitarist by his own like admission, and so a lot of his lines are not particularly athletic or thick. But there's only one song on here where there are two guitar parts. That's like a single note part and chords. And in doing so, he brought our sweet boy Hooky, Peter Hook, to the fore and basically coined a new style of bass playing. I mean, that's why I'm ultimately like a Hook fan over anything, because there are very few people who have revolutionized the instrument, the electric bass. In I would say the first one is James Jamerson. Nobody played bass until he started playing it like that until he picked up a P bass on the Motown stuff.
Can I make a suggestion?
You're gonna say John Entwistle, aren't you?
Oh yeah, that's exactly what I was gonna say.
Yeah. Yes, but yes, sure.
As a lead instrument, I think it's a similar thing where you had a guitarist who was more focused on rhythm slashes, and then you opened the door for the bass as a lead instrument.
It's true, but I don't consider, and this is maybe a spicy take, but I don't consider Entwistle's stuff melodic. I think it's too choppy, and he's playing too many notes. Like, in the sense that Hook is, because Hook was not a virtuoso, you can hear, and I don't mean this as a pun, but hooks to those songs. Like, Entwistle, is just all over the place in a fantastic way. He was a virtuoso, but, sing me the bass part to, the live version of, any of their stuff. It's, 10,000 notes at once, and yeah, so you have rock derived playing, you have R&B derived bass playing, and until Peter Hook, he invented a new vocabulary for the instrument, and all of the post-punk people who would follow in his wake picked up on that template. There's 80s post-punk goth new wave bass playing is not really like much else at the time. And it's down to him.
You're going to get mad at me if you're going to think I'm being difficult. This is a sincere question. To what degree was he influenced by disco? Because I hear a lot of that in his playing.
He was influenced by disco?
Yeah.
I don't think at all.
Hook? Okay.
I mean, just because they got into, in New Order the first New Order stuff was influenced by Italo disco, Moroder and stuff.
Yeah.
But traditional disco bass playing is just octaves, and it's still
That's
really
true.
R&B influence because a lot of it was black guys from New York, know.
Right, yeah.
And I'm not sure how much of Hook would have heard it, but it's so fascinating because he, in the true ways that so much great art is born from limitations, he was doing it out of necessity. Bernard Sumner's first guitar amp was a cheap piece of prior to this, he had just wired his and Hook's instruments into his grandmother's stereo so they could hear each other. And then when the band started writing and rehearsing, having both of their amps so cranked, it essentially stole all the low end out, and Hook couldn't hear himself over the sound of first Bernard's guitar amp being cranked, and then his own bad bass. I'm not even sure if they were making specific bass amps at this time, or they probably were, but it probably wouldn't have been available in Manchester. Because so many early bass things were just we took a guitar head and cranked the bass. And I think it was actually Entwistle who was probably, or Bill Wyman, who were responsible for starting to get bass specific amplifiers made and have the circuitry voiced for the instrument.
I mean, I know in the late 60s they had bass amps because the Bassman sticker on Paul McCartney's bass on the rooftop was taken from a Fender Bassman amp package.
Yeah.
It was case candy that came with the so I think by the time Joy Division were recording, they had bass specific amps. But your point about them not being available
yes, you're
up
right.
in Manchester.
I'm sorry. That is dramatically incorrect. The Bassman came out in 52. So I was incorrect. Mea culpa. But yeah, I mean, it would have been a matter of what was available to him. Anyway, as anyone who's ever tried to play with a practice amp knows, you get no low end out of it, but they are great for treble. And so, Hook was just putting all of his bass lines really high up on the neck because that was all he could hear. And in doing so, created an entire new vocabulary for the instrument. His habit of wearing the bass comically low, in some cases around his knees, was not a sonic choice, though. He admitted to stealing that from Paul Simonon of The Clash. He said, when you've got the bass strap high, playing it is dead easy. When you're going down with the strap, the further you have it, the more bum notes you play. And I was renowned for my bum notes. But you've got to put coolness against bum notes. I play bass in the studio up high, and when people see it, they say, my God, look at how you play bass. That is so damn funny to me. The fact that he was like, no, I know the way that this instrument should be played and the way that it is easier to play. I will not be doing that because it looks cooler.
Because it doesn't look as good.
Martin Hannett and Stephen Morris, the drummer, were also advancing the cause of electronic drums in an extremely infantile state at this point on Unknown Pleasures. I mentioned earlier that Morris was a big fan of Can, and he actually saw this piece of gear on the British cover of Can's Tago Mago, or Tago Mago, never heard it pronounced. He was obsessed with the band's drummer, Jackie Leibzit, and decided he had to find this piece of equipment, which was called a snare. It was a synthetic snare drum thing. And it doesn't even sound like a drum half the time. Like the swooshing noises, the weird swooshing noises you hear on Disorder are the snare, because it worked like an actual synthesizer, like a Moog or whatever, where you can get all these filter sweeps and oscillations out of it. And if you just did that in the quote unquote incorrect way, it would create all these otherworldly noises and textures. I don't know, man. Plug this isolated Stephen Morris track in for like 10 seconds at around the end of the song and hear him seamlessly transitioning from this insane stream of 16th notes on the hi-hat to really intense tom fills and then back into the beat without missing it. And again, he was like 19 or 20. People listening to the sound of Unknown Pleasures frequently use the word space, and that is entirely down to Martin Hannett's innovative use of reverb and several delays, but chiefly one. And not always. I'm contradicting myself immediately. For Insight, he just did the time-honored track of having Ian Curtis sing through a telephone to create the required distance. They also did that with Bad Brains for one of the songs, but that was because HR was in jail.
I didn't know that was a thing. I know I made a joke when we did the Strokes episode about Julian Casablanca sounding like he's singing through an early cell phone, but I didn't know they actually recorded people that way.
Yeah, people, I mean, there's a whole cottage industries of mics that people have made. I mean, back in this era, it would have been a pain in the ass to patch it into a mixing desk, but nowadays people just make and sell bespoke telephone mics. It's because of the compression and everything crunching down of the signal that a telephone mic, induces. People do like that sound, and so now you can just buy an old telephone handset that is just wired into an XLR.
That's awesome.
It's in a lot of garage rock bands. Yeah. The other thing you see a lot is people using the Green Bullet, the Shure mic that was a harmonica mic.
That sounds like a Jack White thing.
Well, yes, probably. But it distorted so much that you see people use the Green Bullet as like a special mic for effect. They'll have like a dedicated vocal mic, and then they'll do something else into the Green Bullet to make it sound all weird. Anyway, Hannett heavily relied on a delay unit called the DMX 1580, which is confusingly not related to the Oberheim DMX drum machine, which Stephen Morris later used in New Order. Hannett's preference may have been because he helped design the thing, although he did so in a typically eccentric way. Advanced Music Systems, AMS, was founded by two guys, former aerospace engineers named Mark Crabtree and Stuart Nevison in 1976, and for a few months they collaborated with Hannett to create the AMS DMX 1580. And they did so by meeting Martin Hannett in a random parking lot between where they were located in Burnley and where he lived in Manchester. And he would get into the back of their car and just rant at them about the qualities that this delay would have, and then he would get out and drive home. And this went on for months. The recording setup at Strawberry Studios had pretty standard pieces of analog reverb and delay stuff. They had eventides, they had a tape phase simulator, they had EMT plate reverbs, they had an actual tape echo, and they had something called the Marshall Time Modulator, which Peter Hook started calling the Marshall Time Waster because of how finicky it was. But the DMX 1580 was the world's first microprocessor controlled digital delay. And I think I've ranted about tape delay on this very podcast before, but that is achieved. The early rockabilly records achieved the slapback effect, and Pink Floyd used tape delay, and like the psychedelic tape delay that you hear is accomplished by having a second reel of tape running varying degrees of lateness in accordance to the main input signal, right? So you get you hear someone go, ah, and then like a millisecond later, the second reel of tape goes, ah, and you increase that distance at very low settings. It's what we call slapback effect, where it's almost indetectable as an actual copy of the sound because it's occurring like a millisecond after. And then, later when they introduced like the Space Echo and what's the other big
Binson
one?
Echo Rec?
The Binson Echo Rec is actually a rotating drum, which is a different style of. Anyway, with all of those delays, because they were tape based and because tape is a decaying source that literally degrades every time you use it, there were all kinds of pitch inconsistencies and wobble or warble, which, people have an affinity for, but was not, accurate to the pitch. So when the digital delay came in, it was a huge deal for engineers and gear nerds because suddenly you had these very pristine repeats that could then be pitch shifted. So you could have a drum hit, and then you could have the drum hit's delay pitched up differently. And that was just radical. And what Hannett did with it was to, on the drums at least, was to pan those two signals hard. So you have the acoustic drum hit in one ear and then the digital delay of it, signal of it in the other ear. And that just gave all of this a spaciousness that you could only previously achieve with reverb. Hannett also used it as an early sampler because with enough time, you could get like an isolated, if you set it to long enough, you could get an isolated signal. So you would hit a guitar chord or hit a snare hit, bop. And then like an appreciable amount of time later, you would hear bop, and he would record the second hit and it trigger that with a keyboard, which is basically he kind of invented sampling, really. So he would take just the delay signal and then be able to reproduce that with a trigger with a keyboard. And that's what he did with, you can hear New Dawn Fades, the weird song, a weird intro to that is what he did with Sumner's guitar. And the Marshall time modulator was a thing to like, they basically just made drums not sound like drums. Stephen Morris would said they put the toms through it and they would just get these very dead, like sounds. And all of this just went into the drum mix and the final mix, which is just, this record still sounds incredible and weird. And like, if you listen to it on good headphones or really good speakers, you can really hear the depth of what he was doing. And when you put that up against like, yeah, dude, a fucking Ramones record, it's insane. It sounds like it was done by aliens. Woo! Edit around that.
Thank you for that. That was Heigl's Techno Wonk Corner.
Yeah, Heigl's Gear Corner.
Beato.
As you meditate on that, we'll be right back with more Too Much Information after these messages.
Well, from the sounds, we go to the words. Everybody, let's all have a group hug before we delve deep into the psyche of one Ian Curtis. Here we go.
All the fun's over.
Yes. Because the band were more concerned with volume than energy in their early days, it wasn't until the recording process began that the other three members of the band actually heard what Ian Curtis was singing about. And, boy, gee golly, that must have been quite an experience.
He's saying what?
As we mentioned up top, Ian Curtis was an intensely literate young man, and he was extremely influenced by writers like Franz Kafka, J.G. Ballard, and Nikolai Gogol, whose works he rated for song titles like Atrocity Exhibition, Colony, and Dead Souls. Disorder opens with the couplet, "I've been waiting for a guide to come and take me by the hand. Could these sensations make me feel the pleasures of a normal man?" God, that's crushing. It's been interpreted by some as alluding to Curtis's struggles both with the symptoms and treatments for his epilepsy and depression. A few lines later, he sings, "Lights are flashing, cars are crashing, getting frequent now. I've got the spirit, lose the feeling, let it out somehow," which you posit is almost certainly a reference to his seizures, as well as J.G. Ballard's Crash, which was a 1973 novel about people with sexual fetishes for car crashes. Interesting.
Yeah, and lights are flashing, getting frequent now. Like, at the time, his seizures were increasing. Again, the band's timeline was so short.
Yeah.
First gig in 77, and by, late 78, they were like, oh, you have epilepsy. Like, you will not be able to live a normal life and continue in this band. And it did get progressively worse, as we'll sadly discuss later.
Insight contains a staggeringly depressing first verse. Guess your dreams always end. They don't rise up, just descend. But I don't care anymore. I've lost the will to want more. I'm not afraid, not at all. I watch them all as they fall. All this stuff was something of a shock for Ian's bandmates because Ian could be as laddish as any one of them, and the piss-taking, heavy-drinking culture of the North meant that his bandmates were frequently in the dark as to the depths of his struggles. Numbness and lack of feeling are recurring motifs. Curtis sings, "The strain's too much, can't take much more. Oh, I've walked on water, run through fire. Can't seem to feel it anymore" on New Dawn Fades, which has become one of the most covered and reused of Unknown Pleasures tracks. One of the album's most oft-discussed lyrics is "She's Lost Control," which is sort of cruelly ironic in that Curtis is singing about an epileptic woman having seizures, and rumored to have died afterwards, which he saw firsthand at one of his day jobs as an assistant disablement resettlement officer, a job he started in September 1977. He'd later write in a March 1980 letter, "I feel it more as I used to work with people who had epilepsy, among others, and every month used to visit the David Lewis Center as part of my job." It's a medical center. "All of the very bad cases are there for treatment or just to be looked after. It left terrible pictures in my mind." It left
That's just
terrible pictures in my mind.
You pick up that job, and then like a year later, you find out you have epilepsy.
Yeah. Curtis added another verse to the song while the band were recording it, leaving it a lyrical chronicle of his experience before and after his diagnosis. What was the verse?
It's the whole second verse where it basically changes it from it like changes the perspective of it to like a witness rather than firsthand. Well, I don't know. Do you want me to look it up? Do you want to get sad?
Yeah, let's get sad.
Let's get sad.
Let's get sad, folks.
Yeah, so the second verse puts it into first person. He says, "Then I had to phone her friend to state my case and say she's lost control again. And she showed up all the errors and mistakes and said, 'I've lost control again.' And she expressed herself in many different ways until she lost control again and walked upon the edge of no escape and laughed, 'I've lost control again.'" God, that song is so haunting. One of the first things I learned on bass, actually.
Oh, wow.
And it's funny because it's famously like it's got a cool like droney part, like that and love the bass line to "Love Will Tear Us Apart" both have like a open string, open D ringing while he plays the riff on the G string. And he said that there's like Peter Hook said that there's like bum notes on it because he couldn't play very well at the time, and so subsequently they would overdub all of those drones. Like he would do the Martin Hannett thing on New Order where he would play the bass riff, one of the riffs first, and then overdub like the droney notes. He was also so famous for his use of the chorus pedal, man. You should put that in later, not what we're talking about in Curtis's depressing ass. But you know, when you hear that like 80s chorused bass tone, that's our boy Hookie. Yeah, man, why don't you just keep going on talking about I Remember Nothing?
I mean, She's Lost Control, though. I just want to say that footage of him performing on, I don't even remember what show it is so upsetting to watch.
Yeah, man, it's horrible. You watch the light drain from his eyes in between the first televised appearance they made on the Tony Wilson thing and then this later thing from just like a year, like maybe not even a year later. Jesus. It is very sad.
And wasn't it theorized that his dance moves, if you could call it that, were sort of inspired loosely by, I mean, that's the theory.
Yeah.
By his epilepsy.
I'm not sure I think his widow, Deborah, who wrote her own deeply sad biography about living with him, I think she said that she had never seen him like link the two in that kind of way. But, you know, there were certainly instances, and we'll talk about one later, where, you know, he had a seizure on stage and people did not cotton onto what was happening because of the way that he danced.
Jesus. Well, I Remember Nothing, meanwhile, it's equally bleak. Great. Okay. I thought we had a respite here. You write, Curtis sings variously at points, get weak all the time, may just pass the time. Me in my own world, you there beside. And trapped in a cage and surrendered too soon, me in my own world, the one that you knew. Oh my.
It's so insane because like in this John Savage oral history, I haven't read Deborah's book, but you know, when his affair happened, he was like still hanging out with Deborah and their daughter, you know, and so much of this was like literally him going through this depression and battling epilepsy, which again, over the course of like a year and change, while his marriage was falling apart, and you know, and they were children. Like he got married at 19. I think she was 16, and like just totally unequipped to navigate this terrain, interpersonally or as part of a marriage. And it's just so sad hearing her talk about like, yeah, he would like go in his room and write, or I would have to wait out hearing him. Like I would have to watch against seizures, and just it just sounds like such a thoroughly miserable way to live. I have no insight to add to that. I'm sorry. Just
well,
so
no, you do. You do. You wrote here. I mean, this is a very insightful paragraph. As you say, it's important to remember that the stigma surrounding people with epilepsy during this era was hardly enlightened. I didn't know any of this. In the United States, for example, 18 states provided for the sterilization on eugenic grounds of people with epilepsy, while in the
In
UK,
this country.
in this country, in the UK, there was a law preventing people from epilepsy from marrying, and it was only repealed in 1970. Less than 10 years before Ian Curtis's diagnosis. Meeting notes from the Royal College of Physicians in the UK in 1968 described those with severe epilepsy as, quote, a major problem in terms of inequalities in treatment access. Even as treatment conditions improved, the stigma still remained. A 1994 survey across the Netherlands, the United Kingdom, and Ireland among a group of professionals, including psychologists, occupational physicians, vocational therapists, and social workers, revealed that 15% of the 76 respondents believed in, quote, the epileptic personality, and 32% believed that epilepsy affected intellectual performance, notions not borne out by the science behind the condition. I had no idea there was any kind of stigma behind epilepsy. None whatsoever.
I mean, they thought it was all part of that UK culture where they were just like, they called them like spastics. Your beloved John Lennon mocked them frequently. To his own amusement and that of others, including to the point where Paul McCartney included a wonderful clip of just such a mocking in that video for that song. Sorry, now I'm just punching down. No, it was awful. I mean, they were lumped into like spastics and that's the point with this whole thing about having epileptic personalities. Like they basically thought it was like, oh, that's the thing that like poor people develop, or like the lower classes develop, and they thought they were like intellectually inferior.
I had never heard that.
Yeah, it's really tragic. And again, you add this to like, dude, if antidepressants and anti-anxiety pills are like throwing a dart at a map today, and as someone who's been on most of them, I can attest that they are, and 5 doctors will be like, yeah, let's try these 3 different things in different dosages. Come back, tell me how that happened, how that went. By the way, that's $200. Just imagine how awful that would have been in the 70s, man. I mean, they just used, it was like a shotgun sledgehammer. It wasn't just like, because even in like, you know, the stuff that they put Nick Drake on for his depression was so just like deadening that their like basic approach was not like, how can we affect the brain chemistry? It was just like, how can we make it not work to the point where it won't hurt anymore? And so they were just putting them on, you know, anything up to and including like lithium and thorazine, and just being like, yeah, see how that works.
And you add, contributing to all this, the whole northern man close-lipped attitude didn't really help much either for Ian Curtis. Though he ended up joining the British Epilepsy Association, and for a time was willing to discuss his condition publicly, Curtis didn't want to be a burden most of all, and so he hid most of his struggles, from his bandmates in particular. One particular theme in Peter Hook's autobiography, Unknown Pleasures, Inside Joy Division, is guilt. He accuses himself, Sumner, and Morris of, quote, selfishness, stupidity, and willful ignorance, and semi-jokes that he could have called the book, "He said he was all right, so we carried on."
Getting back to the actual album, Hook and Sumner initially hated what Hannett had done to their record. They accused him of turning it into a Pink Floyd record, which is hilarious. And Hook would later describe their hatred as the time we were most united. But he has allowed in his later years that, what Hannett ended up doing with their raw materials was, nothing short of revolutionary, and that he was like the fifth member of the band in that regard. I wasn't actually able to trace down a hard source that could prove that the Unknown Pleasures is a Marcel Proust reference, though that phrase appears in Swan's Way. But I did find a hilarious quote from Stephen Morris about it, where he said, "I've heard people say that the title Unknown Pleasures was a Proust reference, which is a good one. We hadn't read much Proust. I think it was just 2 words. It wasn't dug out of a book. If anything, Proust nicked it off us." So that cover, the album cover of all time, maybe? You're going to say Sgt. Pepper's. I know you are.
I mean, this does as much with less, I would say.
Yes, that was exactly how I was going to counter you if you came out with that ridiculous bullshit.
Abbey Road, however, the White Album, however.
I haven't seen very many White Album t-shirts, I'll tell you that. Nor have I seen Disney attempt to market. Oh man, they should. They should market an Abbey Road t-shirt where it's like Mickey, Goofy, the duck.
That's money on the table if they haven't. That's
the fourth one.
The cat.
The cat. God, that joke gets so much mileage. That is an image of the radio waves from the first recognized pulsar. Friend of the pod, CP1919. I bought a copy of this record at our beloved Human Head Records in Brooklyn.
Oh, yes.
If you're in New York, go check them out. Shouts to Travis. Like a decade or at least. And I was at a bar then, subsequently, with my finds in my tote bag. I'm not sure if it was a New Yorker tote. Possibly it was. And I just struck up a conversation with this very well-meaning guy next to me at the bar. And I was just like, he was like, "Oh, you guys bought some records." And I was like, "Oh yeah, Human Head, right down the street. Check them out." And I pulled out my finds and went through them. And when I pulled out Unknown Pleasures, he was like, "Wow, that's a cool album cover."
Was like, he being sarcastic?
No, totally genuine. And because I was like, "Yeah, dude, that's like the album cover. You've not seen it?" He was like, "Yeah, I don't know. It's like someone describing like the Star Wars title crawl as being like, that's a cool intro."
Where was this Duck Duck?
No, Tradesman.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. I used to DJ there.
Yeah. It's one of the most, it's understatement, like the most iconic of all time in just terms of like remixes and parodies that have gone over. It's definitely higher than Black Flag, and I've seen a lot of Black Flag parodies. My favorite was Beach Boys with the bars. Disney in 2012 marketed a t-shirt that had the Mickey Mouse head spelled out in the waves, and then yanked it 2 days later. So if you have one of those, you're sitting pretty.
The original image came from Bernard Sumner's day job at the time near the Manchester Central Library. So when he was bored at work, he'd nick out for a bit and browse the stacks. He said, "I was always looking at space stuff, and when I saw that image, I thought, that would make a really great album cover. When we made the album, I took the image to Peter Saville and said, how about this for a sleeve?" The image originally came from the Cambridge Encyclopedia of Astronomy, 1977 edition, and Saville's great innovation was to color reverse it. It was originally black on white.
I hate that so much.
I know.
There's just the ultimate, like, Andy Warhol bullshit. Like, I bring you a fully formed image that someone else made, and you're like, well, I better recontextualize it by simply flipping the colors. You see? And then I will make money off of it for the rest of time.
But he was right.
He was right.
He was very right.
Yeah.
It wouldn't, I mean, can you imagine if it was like a bright white sleeve?
No, it looked terrible.
It would. And it would also be completely wrong for the ethos of the band.
As he himself states.
Yes. Peter Saville told the Washington Post, "The group asked for it to be white on the outside, and I just couldn't see it. I was afraid it might look a little cheap. I was convinced that it was just sexier in black. This is a radio energy from space. Space, he notes, not many people know this, is black.
I try not to punch down at people intellectually, but like so many people involved in this story just seem like gentle idiots.
Well, Spinal Tap, like what's blacker than black?
Well, yes,
Nothing.
no, but I mean, like, Tony Wilson, like, yeah, architect of like a very specific sound in music in the 80s, changed the music industry. So comically bad with money that it was like a child lived in his head and was doing maths, as they say. You know, love him to death, but like Hookie, Barney, all of these guys just like, were you kicked in the head by a horse? Like, so many of your decisions just... And like Peter Saville, who's like, you know, a legendary designer, quote unquote, but like all of his stuff for... Like even his New Order covers are just other people's paintings with like a little 3-color strip, like, you know, added to it. And he's like, yes, thank you. The genius of my design was making it black instead of white. Holds out hand for check.
But there is a truly hilarious AP photo out there of Saville holding a parody t-shirt that reads, "What is this? I've seen it on Tumblr."
With the waves, yeah. Oh
That's
my
pretty
God,
good.
it's so good.
Saville explained a little further in a short documentary produced about the science behind the cover. The diagram itself is a cutting of the continuous readout and then a stacking, he said. So what you're seeing is this comparative chart of the frequency and the accuracy of the signal.
Yeah, so that's what's really interesting to me about it. I had no idea that, because obviously it would be a unbroken linear signal, right? Because it's regular pulses being emitted. And so this genius diagrammer or illustrator or whatever, you know, placed a series of them vertically to illustrate their regularity and how they were in relations to each other. And that's what makes it such a cool image to me. That's what gives it the ambiguity and the wave-like nature. If that were merely a single horizontal line, it wouldn't look as cool. So, CP 1919, now referred to as PSRB 1919 plus 21, which
To its
just rolls
friends.
off the tongue.
Mine
Your
was
ad-lib
better.
was better. Put that one in. Originally discovered in 1967, it was a radio signal detected using the Interplanetary Scintillation Array, band name calling it, of the Mullard Radio Astronomy Observatory in Cambridge by Jocelyn Bell Burnell. In a development that will surprise no one, Bell's male thesis advisor was awarded the Nobel Prize for this discovery. Although she would eventually win $3 million as a physics prize in 2018. So, you know, not that long later. Initially, because of the regularity and strength of the signal, this will interest you, the scientists jokingly nicknamed it LGM-1. That was its name, for Little Green Men, because they said this signal of this strength and regularity, surely it must be aliens. Scientific American had a very in-depth article about the science of mapping radio signals from pulsars. And this illustration, the Joy Division one, was published in 1970 from the Arecibo Radio Observatory. It was part of Dr. Harold D. Kraft Jr.'s PhD thesis titled, and wait for it, because this title just leaps off the page, Radio Observations of the Pulse Profiles and Dispersion Measures of 12 Pulsars. Who doesn't remember that hit?
Pulsar is a cool word, though.
It's a really cool word. You ever heard of spider pulsars?
No. How has that not been a band name for you or an EP or song title?
I don't know. Do you know what spider... Well, no. Why would anyone know what this was? I learned about it from Twitter. A pulsar is the dense core that remains from a collapsed dead star. And that's how they turn into neutron stars, right? And rotating generates these signals, these pulses, radiation. Spider pulsars are a special class of pulsars because they destroy other stars that orbit them because of the strength of their emanations. They systematically destroy anything in a certain distance around them.
So let me get this straight. A force from a dead star that has the power to destroy other live things in its area.
Yes.
That's the most Heigl thing I've ever heard.
It is.
How has that not been used by you for something?
It's very on brand with me. I will admit. And I'll, I'll get on it. I'll get on monetizing that in some way. I apologize for the oversight. Alex regrets the error.
Spider pulsar. Wow. That's a really... Yes. Anyway, as drummer Stephen Morris recalled, the funniest thing about it was when we first saw the final cover, I said, that'll look really good on a t-shirt. To which their manager at the time, Rob Gretton, replied, we don't do t-shirts. That's a idea.
Again, dumbasses, the lot of them.
Consequently, there was around a decade or so for which the only available t-shirts of this iconic image were bootlegs. As Bernard Sumner would recall, for many years there was a guy called Scotch Tommy who made his own t-shirts and sold them outside our gigs. He made a fortune, I presume, but Rob wouldn't have anything to do with it. He didn't believe in the commerciality. I remember one night after a gig, Scotch Tommy came back and said, I feel really guilty about this. Will you take this check off me? He gave Rob the check, and Rob just ripped it up. If he'd have given it to me instead, that wouldn't have happened. This probably didn't happen when Savile collaborated in the aughts with both designer Ralph Simmons and Supreme on capsule collections based around the design.
I was tracing some of the pop references to the Joy Division thing, and it's a long rabbit hole, but two of the most notable ones of the past decade happened within a year of each other and came from hip-hop, which is really funny. Vince Staples credited his Mexican neighbors in Long Beach with getting him into Joy Division as a kid. And so he did a version of the Pulsar thing, but with ocean waves, with the cover of his 2015 album, Summertime '06. And Danny Brown titled his wildly adventurous 2016 album Atrocity Exhibition after a Joy Division song. So, I don't know, I just think that's neat. I'm forever obligated to mention that Klosterman article where he talks about Morrissey's popularity within the Mexican-American community. So I have to assume Vince Staples was getting Joy Division via his Long Beach Chicano neighbors via their love of Morrissey.
There's a lot of stuff written about Mexican affinity for Morrissey. It's really fascinating to me.
And emo, like in the wake of Morrissey, like MCR and like stuff has become a huge subculture down there. Like,
what's MCR?
You know, My Chemical Romance.
Oh.
Sorry, I assumed you were a fan. I assumed you were a chem head. Oh, I know, I hate them. Meanwhile, the inner sleeve of Unknown Pleasures, If You Even Care, God, was also supplied to Savile by the band, and it took him several months to source it as a photograph titled Hand Through the Doorway, which it indeed depicts, by American photographer Ralph Gibson, who is still alive at 85 years young, from his 1970 book, The Somnambulist.
All of this contributed to Joy Division's austere, quasi-scary image. I'll up it to semi-scary or completely scary. They were told to do as few interviews as possible by their manager because he considered the three non-Ian Curtis members of the band idiots, and their buttoned-up quasi-military fashion went along with some of the idiotic Nazi imagery they'd adopted early on. In Simon Reynolds' book about post-punk, Rip It Up and Start Again, he described Joy Division fans as, quote, intense young men dressed in gray overcoats. That's not ominous.
Yeah, I mean... Yeah, they did arguably like set the template for a lot of post-punk fashion, which was like, we are distinguishing ourselves from punks by being as like drab and utilitarian as possible because of society, I guess. But, you know, Jordan, tell us about the troubling history of this era and adopting or toying with Nazi imagery.
I thought you'd never ask. This was an unfortunately common instance in punk rock at the time, and even nascent goths and post-punks. Susie Sue wore a Nazi pin, and the Sex Pistols were big fans of the imagery as well. Part of it was just the youthful intention to shock. The first wave of British punk musicians were mostly born in the fallout of World War II, WW2 the big one to TMI listeners. And for them, it was sort of like our generation's predisposition to 9/11 jokes, but as you write, on a much, much worse scale, all caps. Bernard Sumner even used the alias Bernard Albrecht early on, supposedly after hearing Bertolt Brecht's name in a documentary, which is either a terrible, flimsy excuse or proof that he is genuinely a dumbass. Your words.
I just think it all adds up. Like, it's just, I'm not making fun of dumb people. I'm making fun of them because they have this, horribly austere image. I mean, that oral history is really illuminating because, you think of them as glowering men who sit around like reading about Bauhaus architecture or something, and they were just so into getting drunk and like playing incredibly juvenile pranks on each other. They paid their one roadie to drink a pint glass of piss and then escalated it to a sandwich, a literal sandwich made of like, try squaring that with like this record. But that's the wonderful contradiction of them.
Bernard Sumner looks like a Nazi. Like, of all the band members.
Well, he got the Hitler Youth haircut. Like,
right.
Which, again, guys, read the room.
John Savage, who published the aforementioned oral history of the band, remembered, "It was a dangerous one and a stupid one, but in essence, it wasn't meant to be taken much more seriously than that," by which he means their Nazi flirtations in fashion. Supposedly, Joy Division wisened up and played rock against isolationism benefits and later denounced fashionism.
When they were caught and called out. Though Unknown Pleasures was a fairly immediate critical hit, it took 6 months after its release on June 15th of 1979 to even notch 15,000 copies sold. Not great numbers at that time, a godsend in these days.
Mm-hmm.
This was bolstered largely by the band's October 1979 tour supporting the Buzzcocks, which was so successful to the point where they were finally able to quit their day jobs. Then the non-album single Transmission came out, which bolstered sales of the albums when it was released in 1979. But Unknown Pleasures didn't even chart in the UK until it was reissued after Curtis's suicide the following May. Unfortunately, the Buzzcocks tour was something of a watershed, terrible, awful beginning of the end moment for Curtis. He and Deborah had their only child, Natalie, in April of 1979. And again, they were literal children. He was 22 years old. Though the tour with the Buzzcocks was relatively stable, he only had 2 seizures during the run, but his fears about his epilepsy were worsening, and to compound matters, he began an affair with a Belgian woman. Annick Honor. And while Honor herself would later claim that her relationship with Curtis was platonic, Curtis's widow, Deborah, denied that. Hilariously and awfully, Ian Curtis supposedly punted the decision whether or not to divorce his wife or stay with her to Bernard Sumner, who wisely demurred. Joy Division toured Europe in January of 1980 and began recording their sophomore album, Closer, in March. Deborah Curtis wrote in her memoir that Ian was beset by the increasing pressure of the band, along with his affair, and his epilepsy and depression. An irregular sleep habit and his refusal to curtail his intake of various substances all contributed to making his seizures more regular. He was experiencing 2 per week while making Closer. One of his greatest fears was dying in his sleep from this. He supposedly told Deborah that was what happened to the woman the song She's Lost Control was written about. So they had this god-awful ritual where if he didn't have a seizure the night of a gig, while playing gig, when he came home, he would just sit in a chair and try and wait out a seizure. Or he would lie in bed next to her and she would stay awake, waiting to hear his breathing change, which would signal the onset of a seizure. And most horrifically, his condition meant that he couldn't hold his infant daughter very often or without supervision in the case that he had a seizure while holding her. That is heartbreaking. And Curtis knew it. He wrote in a March 1980 letter, "The attacks of epilepsy are beginning to frighten me. Sometimes I'm afraid to go out somewhere at night for fear of having a fit in a club or cinema. I get more nervous when we play now for fear of it happening. It seems more frequent. I don't think I could ever set foot on stage again if I had a full stage attack while playing. It gets more worrying with the American tour and lots of other dates coming up. I keep thinking that someday things will be so intense that I'll no longer be able to carry on."
During the recording for Closer, the band noticed that Curtis had been absent for around 2 hours, and Hook found him unconscious in the bathroom, having hit his head on the sink during a seizure. During an April 1980 concert, lighting techs at a venue expressly ignored the band's mandate against strobe lighting, and Curtis collapsed against the drum kit and was carried off stage. 2 days later, he attempted suicide by overdosing on his seizure medication. Incidentally, in Grant Lee and Tom Tensio's 2007 documentary about the band, an epilepsy specialist analyzed Curtis's perception from the time and concluded that it was guaranteed to kill him. How so?
I have to say, in either quantity or the scattershot nature of them, just like, or I would probably quantity and combination, because you remember he was on at least 3 different ones at various points. And, by this time, he's probably either on a combination of them or just one that was so heavy that it would have damaged you. I mean, they were barbiturates. It was like Quaaludes. Like they were in the downer class,
The next month, in May 1980, Curtis visited Deborah, his wife, the day before the band was scheduled to depart for their first North American tour. He wanted to ask her to drop the divorce suit she'd filed after he refused to cut off contact with his girlfriend, Anique Honor, I think is how you say her name. He wrote several letters to Anique while recuperating from his first suicide attempt. She offered to spend the night with him, his wife, or Anique?
Deborah. I didn't write this in, but she had moved out, and she and their daughter were living with her parents.
Okay. She offered to spend the night with Ian, worried about his state of mind triggering a seizure, but after returning from her parents' house, he told her that he wanted to spend the night alone and told her not to come to the house until after he'd caught a train to Manchester at 10 a.m. the next morning. In the intervening hours, Curtis watched Werner Herzog's 1977 film Strozek, which ends with the protagonist's suicide, and listened to Iggy Pop's The Idiot, titled after Dostoevsky's novel of the same name, starring an epileptic prince driven mad by society. He took photos of his wedding day and daughter off the walls and wrote an ambiguous note to Deborah, asking her not to contact him for a while before hanging himself with the washing line in the home's kitchen.
The band were shocked by Curtis's suicide, although Tony Wilson would later recall that Anique told him she'd been terrified after listening to Closer, telling him, "Ian means it." Wilson, with characteristic irreverence, said in an interview later that after Curtis's suicide, his reaction was, he had meant it, adding, "I think we were a bunch of silly not to see it coming." We never listened to his lyrics, Bernard Sumner told Uncut Magazine in 2018. No one sat down and said, "Have you read Ian's lyrics? They're a bit..." Because he was a normal, happy guy. It was very difficult to tell with Ian what he could and couldn't handle. We had no idea. We hadn't known him that long. We didn't know he was approaching his breaking point. One of the more eerie aspects to this is that Closer, having been completed before Ian's death, had the cover art of a family tomb in an Italian cemetery. It was already in place and through the production facility when he killed himself. Some people have posited after the fact that Curtis knew he wasn't up to the continuing stressors of being in Joy Division and was already making peace with the idea of the band continuing without him. He saw it going on without him. Lindsay Reed, whose cottage Curtis stayed in while recuperating from his first suicide attempt, said, "He felt very removed from it. With the epilepsy, he just knew he couldn't carry on with the performances. He'd sort of hit a pinnacle with Closer, and he knew he couldn't go on." In her 1995 book, Touching from a Distance, his widow Deborah wrote, "I believe Ian chose his deadline. It was important for him to keep the charade up in front of the band in case they tried to dissuade him. The only reason he was no longer worried about the American trip was because he knew he wasn't going." Stephen Morris said at one point that the band had made a unanimous decision to rename themselves if any member had left, which he, Hook, and Sumner obviously did, christening themselves New Order and further melding their unique instrumental sound with electronic elements. Obviously, they're an episode of their own, but the long and short of it is that New Order became one of the defining bands of the 1980s with hits like Blue Monday. But their relationship with Factory Records, the club it created, the Hacienda, and themselves eventually soured.
And so did the relationship between Peter Hook and Bernard Sumner. Tensions between the two had begun to increase during the Closer sessions, with Hook clinging on to their roots as punk rockers and Sumner's growing interest in electronic and programmed music. New Order's first single was Ceremony, one of the last Joy Division songs composed by Ian Curtis, who had written the lyrics.
There's such a funny part in Control, the Corbijn movie, where they're obviously trying to paint him as like a lad, and he comes out of like the backstage of some dingy show, and like Ian Curtis is like staring soulfully off into distance, and Hook just staggers out with like, I think, pints in like both of his hands, and he's like, "All right, girls, come to Hooky."
In Hook's book, he talks about how, initially, Ceremony had his, Sumner, and Curtis's voices all overlaid, but Sumner wanted another take and inadvertently, or intentionally, you posit, wiped the other two in the process. Can you imagine wiping your late bandmate's last vocal performance? There's no way that could have been intentional. There was no way that was an accidentally on purpose thing. I refuse to believe it.
You're more charitable towards Barney than Hooky is.
Yeah. Hook was, by his own admission, a wannabe rock star. See the whole bass hanging down by his knees thing. And that contrasted with Bernie Sumner's more bookish, introspective personality. See, this is why I kind of, feel a little more...
Why you like
more
Barney?
I mean, I don't. I like Peter Hook better, but personality-wise, I get it.
Well, yeah.
So, yeah.
Because I'm Hook and you're Sumner.
So I would never wipe.
No, but I mean, those are very obviously the same archetypes, like the Lennon-McCartney one that you and I occupy.
Sumner decided to stop touring during the height of New Order's success, which pissed Hook off to no end. When they did play live, Hook painted Sumner as a consummate diva, always late and whining. Behavior bolstered when a stomach ulcer forced Sumner out of commission and led to a canceled date, which Hook says convinced Sumner, quote, "They need me. They can't do it without me." The personal stuff was compounded by the idiotic finances behind factory records in the band. Blue Monday became the best-selling 12-inch single of all time, but the elaborate sleeve designed by Peter Saville meant that it lost 5 pence for every copy sold.
Hilarious.
And the Hacienda Club, which Peter Hook and New Order co-owned, I believe, because they wrote the book about it. I think it's called How Not to Manage a Club, if I recall, was losing something like £10,000 a week, which meant tour revenue was constantly going to pay for their debts. It all just kept getting worse and worse. For Peter Hook, the beginning of the end came when Bernard Sumner teamed up with Smith's guitarist Johnny Marr for a side project.
And hilariously claims that Marr approached him first. With the line, which I cannot actually imagine Johnny Marr saying, "The best guitarist in Manchester should make an album with the best bassist in Manchester."
Yeah, Johnny Marr's too sweet for that.
Yeah, it's just, and then Peter Hook said he declined because he was too dedicated to New Order. It's just like, yeah, I mean, I love the guy, but he definitely rewrites things in his own favor.
Hook got sober, and Sumner said that actually made him a worse person, which is an amazing thing to say about anyone, especially a bandmate that you've known for decades. Hook also purchased the rights to the Hacienda Club name out from under the rest of the band and began licensing quite liberally, which annoyed the others, no doubt, who thought it was a group venture. Eventually, the band split very publicly, and in dueling memoirs by Bernard Sumner and Peter Hook, they dragged each other through the mud. And there was also a royalties-based lawsuit by Peter Hook.
Do you know about that one?
I must have written about it for the Rivals episode, but I don't remember it now.
He essentially sued them, claiming that they formed a separate LLC or like a separate corporation and dealt themselves a royalty rate higher than his without his knowledge. And it basically got settled. Like, the judge looked at this and was like, "I think this case has merit, but I would urge you all to settle it rather than go through court costs." That's what they did. It's just so, I mean, we know that happens. Who are we talking about that 4 guys negotiated a higher royalty rate than the other guy when they re-signed?
Well, Van Halen. Seems like a Van Halen thing.
Oh, yeah. Yes. Yeah. If you remember, that is one of the conflicts in Van Halen. The brothers, and I think it was the brothers and Michael, the bassist, around the time the Greatest Hits collection came out, like, quietly signed a new contract that cut David Lee Roth in for much less. Ugh.
And now Peter Hook tours as Peter Hook and the Light, playing Joy Division and New Order songs, while Bernard Sumner continues to tour as New Order.
That was supposedly another point of contention with them, that Peter Hook wanted to keep playing Joy Division songs, and Sumner said no.
Huh.
Do you have anything else to add before I get all bummer and serious again?
I mean, it's interesting if he really did erase Ian Curtis's voice on Ceremony, because maybe he really does just want to, start fresh.
Yeah. Have you read Bernard's book?
I did years ago. It was a lot less mean than Peter Hook's, but a lot less fun.
Yeah, I think Hook's whole thing with it was, like, reading that book, you'd think Bernard Sumner never quarreled with anyone who wasn't Peter Hook. Which is a great quote. I'm telling you, man, he's got the better quotes. He looks cooler. Now for final thoughts. I truly don't know how we're going to transition into this. So we won't. Writing this, I got a little bit sidetracked with the New Order stuff, and it is fascinating, obviously. But if I can do my Jerry Springer final thought moment, I think that the entire saga of Ian Curtis and Joy Division is communication is really important, not just in the New Order situation where they just were refusing to talk or negotiating this stuff, but especially with Ian, where it's like, reach out to someone if you're in pain. For the love of God, just do it. Don't be afraid of being a burden. I hope that attitude is not as prevalent in 2024 as it was in 1980. But, when you hear this constant theme of all the people ostensibly closest to him who said, we had no idea. We're contributing to an irresponsible lionization of Curtis's suicide as some kind of foregone poet's gesture, when it really should be looked at as a warning not to isolate yourself because of your own pain. There's a repeated line in Joy Division's Atmosphere, don't walk away in silence. And it's a sentiment that Ian, after writing it, ultimately ignored. As good as the music on Unknown Pleasures is to listen to, if you find yourself in a bad place, learn from it. Stay here and talk. I'm Alex Heigl. This has been Too Much Information.
I'm Jordan Runtagh. We'll catch you all next time.
Too Much Information was a production of iHeart Radio.
The show's executive producers are Noel Brown and Jordan Runtagh.
The show's supervising producer is Michael Alder June.
The show was researched, written, and hosted by Jordan Runtagh and Alex Heigl,
with original music by Seth Applebaum and the Ghost Funk Orchestra.
If you like what you heard, please subscribe and leave us a review. For more podcasts on iHeartRadio, visit the iHeartRadio app, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you listen to your favorite shows.